Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to Let's Have Renaissance, a podcast about writing, editing, publishing, literature, the arts, and more. I am Ito Utini.
And I'm Makaya Utini, and today we're speaking with Peter Kline. Peter is the author of two collections of poetry, Deviants and Mirrorforms, and his poems have placed first in contests run by River Styx, the Southwest Review, and the Columbia Review, and have been anthologized by Random House, Kin House, and Persea Books. He teaches at the University of San Francisco, and in 2012, he founded the San Francisco literary series Bazaar Writers Salon, which he still directs. We're excited to be with him today.
Thank you for tuning in. We're excited that you're here. Why don't you also subscribe, like, comment, and share this episode with your friends?
And if you know anyone who wants to come on the podcast, please do send them our way. Also, if you haven't yet, sign up for our free newsletter where we share updates, resources, and opportunities. To support the podcast, you can make a one-time donation through our website or purchase a subscription to our blog where you'll find more premium content and resources at thedatekeepers.com. Thank you for being a part of our community.
Peter, thank you so much for joining us. We're excited to have you. Can you tell us about yourself and what are you working on now?
Sure. Well, I'm always writing poems. I have two current projects. One is a manuscript that's basically finished. That's a collection called Protagonist, and it's a series of poems that mainly engage with the pandemic. And so the heart of that book is a long sequence of prose poems that engage with comfort media, basically the kind of things that we were binge watching to kind of escape all of the chaos and dread of that time. And so they kind of frequently defamiliarize or twist or undermine a lot of those kind of comfort stories, or at least the stories that I used to find comforting in light of all of the events of that time. So that's the manuscript that's basically finished up right now. And then, as I said, I'm always writing poems. And so I've kind of moved on to a new project now. It's still inchoate. I don't have a title for it. It's not a manuscript at all yet, but I've been working on a sequence of poems that all work without punctuation or capitalization. And so it's really different kind of project from what I was working on before. It's kind of liberating because it's allowing me to say things that I might not otherwise say.
That's cool.
Where did the idea come from? Because it immediately put me in mind of like the ancient texts before punctuation had even been developed and implemented as part of written language. Was that part of the impetus, or like how did you come to that form?
Yeah, interesting. I hadn't even thought of it in terms of ancient traditions, but of course there's a relationship there. The writers that I'm in touch with in terms of these techniques are more recent. The first who comes to mind probably instantly for any poet who's thinking about these things is E. Cummings. He's the first kind of modern poet that I know of anyway who engaged in widespread experiments with that kind of work. More recently, I've been reading the work of a German poet called Max Sesner, who is just terrific. He writes a kind of subtle version of that technique. It's not too aggressively kind of playing with syntax, but there will be these kind of slippages midline where all of a sudden you realize that you've kind of broken into another thought or another sentence without quite realizing it. You kind of have to do a double take and look more closely at it. There's a Bay Area poet, Francesca Bell, who translated him, and that's how he came to my attention. And so that's one of the major influences on this project. And the poet Ellen Bryant Boyd fairly recently has also come out with a book making use of that technique. And I was certainly aware of that when I started on this as well, although I kind of only have gone back to that more recently. I was working on these for a while before I touched base with her work again.
And how are you planning to sell that to the publishers? As we know, it's hard enough to sell poetry that the general public is used to. Like, how are you planning to package and sell it and find an audience for it?
Yeah, well, with poetry, the audience is always, or not always, but usually quite small. I don't generally tend to worry about that too much. I write the best poems that I possibly can, the ones that interest me, that most powerfully capture emotion, that do interesting things with language, that, say something important about the human experience. And I basically operate under the assumption that if I do a good enough job of it, that eventually people will get interested and read it. And that may happen, long after I'm gone, and I'm perfectly okay with that. Of course, I would much rather have an audience right now, but finally, I write the poems because I love them and because I want to make them as beautiful and realized as I possibly can, and I kind of let the readership sort itself out in the end.
So do you ever get poetry fatigue? Like, I ask because sometimes Ito and I are both prose writers and we collaborate on all of our fiction and we work on this stuff all the time. But sometimes I just get burnt out and I don't always know that I'm getting burnt out. And sometimes I think like, okay, this story just is not working. Like no matter how I try to put this together, it's not working. And I've gradually learned over time that a test that I can use to see if it's actually not working or if it's just that I'm burnt out and nothing seems to be working is I'll pick up like a novel that I love, like a Garcia Marquez novel or something, and I'll read a few passages. And if that bores me, then I'm like, oh, I think I'm just really burnt out right now. And nothing sounds right and nothing reads correctly, like nothing has vitality to it. But if the book that I love still resonates with me, that's a signal that, okay, something in what we're doing is not working. Do you ever have that? And like, when do you know that it's time to just step away and take a break?
Yeah, a great question. Certainly it happens to me. And generally I can tell if I sit down to work on the same poem, say several sessions in a row and make absolutely no progress. I sit down the following day and I basically scribble out everything that I did the day before. And if that happens, 4 or 5 times in a row, then I can really tell that something is not right with my relationship to maybe to poetry in general or to the work. I also I read as a kind of way to get out of that state of mind. It doesn't always work, but I find, touching base with old favorites is almost always a way to kind of just renew myself. But I think time is the most important thing. And how long, it's hard to say. A couple weeks, especially for if I'm having trouble with one particular poem, a couple weeks or maybe a couple months. I've waited as long as a couple years for certain poems that, I knew there was something there and I just couldn't get it right. I was, just kind of spinning my wheels with it. And it took a couple years finally to be able to come back to it with the right perspective on it.
That's interesting because I am different than you guys. And I think the reason is that because I am a multilingual. And so I have 2 ways of knowing what's going on when, like, I read, but I read for fun and pleasure. Like, I don't have a book that I go back to and reflect. What happens to me is that I lose the language. And if I cannot make sentences in English, I try to go back to my other languages, even way back to my mother tongue. And I can't make sentences in those languages either. And I'm like, okay, time to take a break and go listen to music or whatever and wait until I reset. That's why we also have a lot of projects so that we can switch, go to edit the podcast or, whatever, like anything else that is far away from the piece that I'm working on because the language just deserts me for a while.
So when you said like a couple days or months or years, do you mean from one poem or do you mean from poetry altogether?
Oh, yeah, that's just from one poem. Yeah, I think only once in my life can I remember going through an extended period of time in which I just couldn't write. It was shortly after grad school. I was in the midst of really heavily teaching for the first time. And I just was not having any success at all writing. I think I wrote maybe one poem that whole year, which for me is, not that I write a ton, I work slowly, but just everything that I was working on in that year, except for the one poem, which was an important one. It was a kind of milestone poem that was pushing me into a new way of working. But everything else I was working on in that year didn't go anywhere. And, I wasn't working that much because it was such a frustrating enterprise. This was about almost 20 years ago now when that happened. But that's the only extended period of time that I can think of that I just could not get any traction at all in my writing. So mostly it's single poems that kind of exhaust my resources for a while. But usually at that point, I can go to revision work. There's always other kinds of work I can engage in. I don't write a ton of essays, but sometimes I might go to more nonfiction kinds of writing to try to get out of that if I'm having trouble with poetry.
Speaking of other work, how's teaching going?
The teacher's great. I am a little bit of a shy person. I'm not the most naturally comfortable in front of people. And so before I go into class, I often have a kind of social anxiety. I've been teaching for more than 20 years and still I experience that. But once I'm in the classroom, it actually completely disappears and I feel great. I love talking to the students, hearing what they have to say about poems.
And have you seen any trends over the course of your career in academia?
Yeah, I've noticed some changes. I teach mostly short poems. And so what I've heard from people teaching fiction in particular or other longer kinds of texts is that it's difficult to get students to read nearly as much as they used to. I mean, I remember when I was in college, I was reading hundreds of pages a week. That was just routine. And I've heard that that's kind of less possible to expect of students these days. Because I teach poetry mainly, I think I experience less of that. But I do think there's probably a little bit less attention span for reading, even in my classes, than I might have seen in the past. There's a little bit of AI. Again, because I teach creative writing, most students, I think, are not inclined to generate their poems with AI tools. But I have seen a couple that certainly, I had suspicions that they were generated that way.
Yeah, that was actually my next question because, as a writer, I am not afraid of AI. Let it write, let it do whatever its creators think it can do. But when I was looking into this a few years ago, the first, I think, writing that was written by AI is actually poetry. What is your take on that?
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts. As far as teaching, I think why I resist my students using it is because what I want them to do when I'm asking them to respond to a poem is to, first of all, to think about it, and second of all, to learn to put their thoughts into writing. And if they just put a prompt into AI, they're basically doing neither. They're basically cheating themselves. As far as, generating poems, I think there's some questions. Why do we read poems? What do we want from poems? And there's a school of thought that says, well, I read a poem so that I can know the truth of somebody's experience with the world. And if you're getting that from AI, then you're not getting that. It's a kind of amalgamation of whatever it is, all these kind of texts from all these sources, and it's not reflecting a kind of human experience of the world. On the other hand, that's only one theory of what it is to read a poem or engage with a poem. Another one is I want to have an experience with language, and the creator of that language doesn't mean much to me at all. It's just about the kind of experience I have. Kind of think about looking at sprays of color or something like that are engaging to the senses and maybe stimulating to the mind and have nothing to do with any kind of specific human experience. They're just a way of kind of giving pleasure to our minds. And I mean, maybe a computer can generate material like that, and eventually it might be able to do it with the kind of sophistication that leads to complete absorption on part of people engaging with it.
One thing that I have not seen discussed very much, and I think there's an interesting discussion to be had here, is that different genres will fare differently with AI. And I don't necessarily mean, it may be the case that some commercial genres of fiction might be more easily automated just because of what readers want formula in certain genres, but that's not really what I'm talking about, because for every genre, there's a more sophisticated version of it that is non-formulaic that I think AI would still struggle to generate, even if it could generate the more formulaic version, which there's a formulaic version of literary fiction too. So,
Sure.
But what I mean by a genre is genres are like cultures. They come into being in response to circumstances that may or may not continue to exist.
Yes.
But the rules of a genre are responses to something in the world, and then they become independent of whatever that source was. So one genre that I think AI will actually be able to do rather well is satire. And the reason I think that is that AI is already, just by definition, sort of a satire of human artistic production. Without even trying, that's just what it is.
Yeah.
There's not an intent to produce a satire necessarily, but you can read the output as satire. And I wonder if you've thought about this, and if so, if there are any other genres that you think AI can handle just because of the nature of what that genre is and does.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe the first thing I'll say is Ezra Pound famously and maybe controversially said the highest form of genius is satire, which I always found to be a kind of shocking statement and one that was not at all intuitive to me. But I wonder what Pound thinks about AI, but I think I have a pretty good sense of what Pound would think about AI.
Yeah.
It seems to me probably the longer a genre has been established, maybe the more successfully AI might be able to approximate it. I don't know. Now I'm going to hedge on that a little bit. If a genre is really codified, I guess is what I mean to say, then I would think that AI would be more able to, successfully produce an example of it. That said, what makes writing interesting is the way that it doesn't just reproduce codified anything, it does something new with it. And so, whether AI would be able to accomplish that, I think is a very separate question.
One thing that AI will not accomplish is our firsthand experiences. It wouldn't be able to share our personal stories. And I personally think if we come as humans together to talk to one another and to share our stories, then we will continue to have the power, the ability to share our own stories. If people know that someone has similar life experience to them or even different, but they want to learn about them, they're more likely to react to that person. I think AI is scaring a lot of people because of loneliness, because of people being isolated, divided. But if we come together as humans, we will be able to share our stories with one another and not be interested in what the machines create. We always ask our guests to read. Do you have a poem or a few poems that you would like to share with us?
Yeah, absolutely. I have three ekphrastic poems here. Ekphrastic poems are poems that engage with another work of art, especially visual art. And so these are three sonnets that I wrote that are engaging with Francis Bacon self-portraits. Maybe I'll just give a little bit of context. These are engaging with self-portraits from 1971 and 1972, which was a particularly tragic period in Francis Bacon's life after the suicide of his lover. And so if you take a look at these paintings, you will see the kind of anguish in the paintings, and I just responded really strongly to them the first time I saw them. So that's, I hope, reflected in these poems. So three poems here, the triptych for Francis Bacon. Number one, Self-Portrait, 1971. This is in the voice of the viewer. Yes, I can see you now. Oil-rich pastels are generous. Paid by the light, they give back a fair return. Moneying your brow, slicking your hair and starching the shirt at your neck. The only anti-opulent is black, but black is most of you. It starts in the throat and the bankrupt eyes, till everywhere you look or refuse to look, there's nothing, only light withheld, a private universe of debt. Some balance is due, Francis. You expend your mouth in vapor, slowly integrate with dissolution. You've begun a stalled withdrawal into the place no bondsmen go, caught in the clauses of your changing will. Number two, this is Self-Portrait, 1972. This is in the voice of the paint. How thoughtful of this gentleman. He cut his face away to make more space for me. I am the darkness islanding his eye. I am the fat black belt around his throat. He's a little dreamy, a little flayed as my nullifying finger finds his cheek and slips between his lips, a thing to suck or bite down hard on, according to his need. What else he needs, he won't confide to me, his lover, his companion, not his friend. Maybe some other man, the one his hand flinches from making visible day by day in serial dread, will show us who he is. Elusively, his lives resemble his. And here's the third one, also Self-Portrait, 1972. This one is in the voice of the image. I prove the physics. Time is just a quirk of how a body relates to heavy light. Mine it repulses. Thus, I'm always late, rippling behind the moment like a cloak. Thus, my life runs counter to the clock, and what you see of me, this flickering face, is ageless. Hot blood throbbing to the surface, my forehead sleek, my forelock luscious black, while those around me, whom I live for, die. I'm looking at them now. I've made their home just past the frame where you are. In that world, what's done stays done. So take care what you do while there's still time for you to postpone harm or cause it. Every future is a wound.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we appreciate you making the time.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you as well. This was such a pleasure.
It was great
Thank
talking
you
with
so
you.
much. Great talking to you. Take care.
Bye.